in the soft, fading light of an ancient eastern sky, long before the world became tangled in global rivalries and colonial ambitions, there existed a land so vast, so culturally rich, and so elegantly organized that many believed it would stand forever. This was the Qing Empire, China's last great dynasty, a civilization crowned with silks, poetry, philosophy, and breathtaking order. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, we drift together back into that world. A world where the clatter of horse hooves on stone courtyards echoed through majestic palaces, where scholars dipped their brushes into black ink to shape the future with poetry, and where ordinary families lived simple lives under a thousand-year-old rhythm of harmony. The Qing Dynasty at its peak was not simply a government, it was a living organism. A world where emperors were seen as the sons of heaven, responsible not only for ruling the empire, but for maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. Imagine yourself there. In a morning thick with gentle mist, a courtyard paved with age-old stones, touched by the footsteps of emperors and servants alike. The faint rustle of silk robes, the aroma of jasmine tea drifting through the palace halls, and the quiet hum of a nation at peace. This was China before disruption, before the ships arrived, before the traders brought their dangerous goods, before opium darkened the soul of an empire that once glowed with brilliance. But tonight, we are not rushing toward the fall. Tonight, we rest gently in the Golden Age, a time when prosperity stretched across cities and farmlands, where the empire's borders were vast and secure, and where millions lived under the comforting belief that China was the center of the world. Let your mind settle there for a moment. Allow the quiet order, the soft elegance, the ancient harmony to wash over you like a warm, slow-moving river. Because this story, the story of how opium shattered a mighty empire, is most powerful when we first understand just how peaceful, how organized, how impossibly refined that empire once was. At its height, the Qing Empire ruled more land than almost any other dynasty in Chinese history. Its armies stood strong, its scholars were revered. Its network of trade stretched across mountains, deserts, and oceans, and its people lived under a well-defined social structure that had guided generations for centuries. Imagine walking through one of its thriving marketplaces, vendors arranging baskets of tea leaves, spices, silk thread, and porcelain, farmers unloading fresh vegetables, artisans carving jade ornaments that glimmered softly in the morning sun, children chasing each other through narrow alleys paved with stone. Noble families carried in sedan chairs, while monks walked barefoot, whispering silent prayers. The empire was calm, confident, and deeply rooted, a world where tradition shaped every movement. A world so complete that foreign influence seemed unnecessary, even unwelcome. And yet, beneath this graceful calm, destiny was waiting. Foreign traders were waiting. And the substance that would one day unravel everything was already making its way toward China's shores. But not yet. For now, the empire breathes slowly, peacefully. And as you drift with this story, your own breathing begins to match its rhythm, steady, gentle, unhurried. This is the foundation of everything that comes later, the greatness before the destruction, the harmony before the chaos, the peace before the storm. And tonight, as you listen, you stand right at the heart of it. As we move deeper into the heart of the Qing Empire, let your mind drift further into its quiet elegance. Picture a civilization where time itself seemed to flow in a slower rhythm. A society built upon centuries of tradition, where every movement, from the bow of a merchant to the brushstroke of a scholar, held meaning. The people of the Qing Dynasty lived in an intricate harmony, woven from Confucian values that shaped their identity. Respect for elders, devotion to family, loyalty to the emperor, and the pursuit of knowledge. These were not just ideals, but the invisible threads holding society together. Imagine standing inside a vast, tranquil courtyard. The air is still, almost heavy with history. Red lacquered pillars rise like ancient guardians, supporting roofs designed to withstand centuries of sun, wind, and rain. You hear nothing but the distant echo of a gong marking the hour, carried softly through the palace corridors. Within this world, morning rituals were sacred. Scholars woke before sunrise, lighting oil lamps to continue their classic studies. Confucian texts, poetry, philosophy, and scrolls carefully preserved through dynasties. Their work was slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful, Even their desks, carved from fine wood, were polished smooth by generations of careful hands. Outside the walls, hardworking farmers tended to their rice paddies. Their lives were simple yet essential. If scholars formed the mind of the empire, farmers were its beating heart. Before dawn, you would see them stepping barefoot into the shimmering water of the paddy fields, the glow of early morning reflecting like tiny stars between the rows of rice. Their movements were rhythmic, almost meditative. And as the day brightened, merchants opened their stalls, arranging silk rolls dyed in vibrant reds, deep blues, and soft greens. Craftsmen displayed delicate porcelain that almost seemed to glow when touched by sunlight. These were not mere products. Each piece carried the spirit of its maker. There was a profound sense of order to everything, a cosmic balance between heaven, earth, and humankind, an order the Chinese believed would last forever. Even the emperor lived within this harmony. The Son of Heaven was not simply a ruler. He was a symbol. His responsibility was to maintain moral integrity, perform rituals, and ensure that the mandate of heaven remained upon the empire. If natural disasters struck, if the people suffered, it was believed that the emperor must examine his own actions, for heaven judged him through the state of the world. This belief gave the Qing Dynasty a unique stability. People felt safe, protected, guided by traditions older than memory itself. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the quiet rhythm of these ancient days. See the fishing villages along the southern coast, wooden boats drifting gently across calm waters. Fishermen humming old folk tunes as they throw their nets. Children playing along the shore, their feet brushing warm sand. See inland towns, where families gathered in tea houses, sharing steaming cups of oolong while storytellers narrated heroic tales. The smell of roasted chestnuts filled the air, mixing with the subtle fragrance of incense wafting through open doors. In the capital, noble families started their day with disciplined calm. Silk-robed officials prepared for meetings at the imperial court. They carried scrolls tied with red string, their footsteps soft on polished stone floors. The palace was alive, yet quiet, its sounds muted by its sheer vastness. Even the animals added to the peaceful rhythm. Horses resting in stables, cranes wandering near ponds, and golden koi fish gliding slowly through garden lakes. This was the Qing Dynasty's golden image, a civilization so confident, so deeply rooted, that it seemed untouched by the outside world. But beyond China's borders, the world was changing rapidly. Industrial revolutions, colonial ambitions, maritime explorations. Nations from the West were hungry for influence, markets, and resources, and China, content in its old order, barely noticed. The empire believed itself complete, self-sufficient, too advanced to need foreign products, foreign ideas, or foreign alliances. This belief, as comforting as it was, would soon become one of the empire's greatest vulnerabilities. Because outside China's peaceful cities and ancient walls, merchants from across the sea were growing restless. They wanted China's tea, silk, porcelain, treasures that Europe craved. But the Qing government imposed strict rules, limiting trade to a single port. Foreign traders found themselves bound, restricted, frustrated by the empire's confidence. So they searched for a way in, a product the Chinese would desperately want. Something irresistible, something profitable, something with the power to break the balance that had lasted for centuries. Opium, a substance that would creep into the empire like a silent shadow, slipping past guards, merchants, and laws. A substance that would one day turn this peaceful civilization into a battlefield of addiction, corruption, conflict, and humiliation. But that is a story for later. For now, stay in this moment of quiet serenity. Feel the warm, slow heartbeat of an empire at peace. Allow the calmness to settle into your mind, helping you drift deeper into rest. This peace is precious, because once opium arrives, this world will never be the same again. As the Qing Dynasty continued its quiet journey through time, its people remained deeply connected to their traditions. Every aspect of life followed the rhythm of rituals and customs passed down through generations. There was comfort in this continuity, a sense that the world would always remain predictable and familiar. Imagine walking down a narrow stone street in a bustling Qing-era town. The morning sun creates long shadows across the market stalls. Vendors call out softly, inviting customers to examine their fresh vegetables, handmade fans, polished jade ornaments, and delicate wooden carvings. The faint scent of incense drifts from a nearby temple, blending with the aroma of steamed dumplings and hot tea. Women in flowing silk robes move gracefully through the crowd, carrying baskets filled with daily necessities. Their hair is styled with ornate pins shaped like flowers and butterflies. Small children run past them, laughing as they chase each other around a stack of ceramic pots. A dog sleeps lazily in the warm sunlight near the entrance of a shop. Beyond the market lies a cluster of quiet residential streets. Homes are arranged around inner courtyards, decorated with bonsai trees, lanterns, and small fish ponds. Inside one of these homes, a family prepares a simple but elegant meal: rice, vegetables, perhaps a bit of fish. They sit together on low stools, eating slowly and mindfully, for meals were not just nourishment, but part of a peaceful daily rhythm. This was life in the Qing Dynasty, steady, harmonious, shaped by the belief that the old ways were the best ways. Even the education system reflected this. Students spent years memorizing classical texts. The imperial examinations were the gateway to success, offering talented young men the chance to become government officials. For many families, having a son pass the exam meant honor, stability, and a better life. Nights were often illuminated by oil lamps as determined scholars wrote and rewrote passages, repeating ancient lines until they became part of their souls. In the countryside, life flowed at an even slower pace. Villagers depended on the cycles of nature, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, preparing for winter with careful precision. At dusk, families gathered outside their homes, listening to elders tell stories of legendary heroes and ancient battles. Fireflies drifted through the warm night air, their gentle glow adding magic to the silence. Travelers along the Silk Road brought whispers from faraway places: India, Arabia, Persia, Europe. Exotic spices, rare gemstones, strange fabrics. These treasures amazed the locals, yet China still believed it needed nothing from the outside world. The empire was grand, complete, self-sustaining. Why look outward when everything necessary for life already existed within its borders? And yet, this confidence also created a subtle blindness. A belief that the world beyond the mountains and the seas could never threaten them. That foreign powers were too distant, too disorganized, too weak to matter. But across the ocean, countries were changing. Factories thundered with the birth of industry. Steam-powered ships crossed vast seas faster than ever before. Nations expanded, hungry for trade, influence, and control. To them, China was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. For now, though, in this peaceful chapter of history, the empire slept, secure in its ancient traditions, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon. Imagine this moment like the final calm before a great transformation. Inside imperial palaces, officials gathered for ceremonial meetings. They wore embroidered robes that displayed their ranks: dragons for the highest, cranes and clouds for the scholars, and waves for the military officers. Their discussions centered on tax records, land disputes, and yearly harvests. Not one of them could imagine the foreign ships that would someday surround their coastline, or the foreign diplomats who would soon demand rights the empire had never granted. In garden ponds, lotus flowers opened with the morning light. Bright koi fish swam in lazy circles, creating ripples that shimmered like silk. A pair of elderly scholars walked across a stone bridge, their hands tucked into long sleeves as they discussed poetry and philosophy. They believed, as their ancestors had believed, that wisdom and virtue were the foundations of a strong empire. They could not foresee the opium that would poison their people, the corruption that would seep into government halls, the conflicts that would weaken their borders, the humiliation that would scar their nation for generations. But for now, peace endured. Picture a traveler arriving in Beijing at sunset. He sees the glow of lanterns lighting the streets, hears the distant music of a guzheng being played by a young woman on her balcony, feels the evening breeze carrying the smell of roasted duck and jasmine tea. This is the world that would soon collide with unstoppable global forces, and yet in this moment it is beautiful, serene. Untouched, as you listen, allow this image of ancient China to guide your mind into deeper calm. Let the soft rhythm of old traditions steady your heartbeat. Let the quietness of the empire ease your thoughts. Because even though great turmoil lies ahead, this chapter, this peaceful beginning, is essential to understanding the story that will follow. Soon, foreign ships will arrive with their dark cargo. Soon, the first cracks will appear in the ancient walls of China's confidence. Soon, everything will change. But for now, breathe with the stillness of the Qing Dynasty. Rest in the harmony of its people, its culture, its timeless rituals. This is the last deep breath of an empire, before the world forces it awake.
Imagine yourself drifting gently into a quiet moment in time. A vast empire, calm on the surface, yet unaware that a silent tide is beginning to pull at its foundations. The Qing Dynasty, proud and ancient, is about to face a force unlike anything it has seen before. Not an invading army, not a famine, not a rebellion, but something far more subtle, far more dangerous. This chapter begins in the late 18th century, when China stood as one of the most self-sufficient civilizations on Earth. The empire was wealthy, productive, and culturally rich. Its people worked their land, traded their silk and porcelain, and drank their delicate green tea as part of their daily rituals. China did not feel the need for anything from the outside world, and for a long time, that independence gave the Qing rulers an unshakable confidence. Meanwhile, far across the sea, the British Empire was going through a very different kind of transformation. Britain had industrialized rapidly. Factories demanded new markets. Merchants needed new products to sell. And tea, Chinese tea, had become an obsession. In London, in Edinburgh, in the cold towns of industrial England, tea had become the drink of the masses. It warmed the workers waking up before dawn. It soothed the wealthy during their evening gatherings. But there was one problem. Britain had nothing China wanted in return. China accepted payments only in silver, a metal that carried immense value. And so, ship after ship sailed from Britain to Canton, carrying silver coins that poured into Chinese coffers. Over time, this created a trade imbalance so deep that British economists panicked. Silver was flowing out of Britain so fast that the country faced a monetary crisis. Something had to change. And this is where the story begins to shift. Quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. British merchants, especially those connected to the powerful East India Company, discovered a product that the Chinese government forbade, but many Chinese citizens secretly desired: opium, a bitter brown resin processed from the poppy fields of British-controlled India. Opium provided a temporary escape, a warmth and numbness that slowly wrapped itself around the mind. At first, the trade was small. A few smuggled chests, hidden in the lower decks of trading ships. A handful of middlemen passing the substance into eager hands. But as demand grew, the merchants realized they had found the perfect solution. They could sell opium to China in huge quantities and use the silver they received to buy the tea they craved. This created a new flow of wealth. Not silver into China, but silver out of China. The tide had begun to turn. Imagine the quiet hum of a port city along the Pearl River. Lanterns glowing on the docks. Boats brushing against each other in the night. The flicker of candlelight inside hidden storage rooms. And behind closed doors. British merchants sitting with Chinese smugglers, whispering deals that would ripple across the empire. Opium entered China like a soft fog. Not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly, silently, through the dreams of its people. As the trade grew, British ships no longer needed to hide their intentions. Offshore receiving ports were established, floating warehouses at sea, where smugglers could pick up opium without stepping into official harbors. Chinese merchants, civil servants, and even some local officials became part of the trade, tempted by the enormous profit. And with each transaction, silver slipped away from China. The imperial treasury noticed this, but struggled to understand the scale of the problem. Reports trickled into Beijing describing strange patterns, increased addiction in coastal towns, missing revenue, unexplained shortages of silver in regional banks. The empire was vast. Communication was slow, and many officials were more interested in protecting their positions than reporting the truth. Corruption found fertile ground. Some officials accepted bribes to look the other way. Others underestimated the growing dependence among the population. And many believed the problem would disappear on its own, just another trend passing through the southern provinces. But it did not pass. By the early 19th century, opium smoking had turned from a luxury habit of the wealthy into a widespread addiction affecting laborers, scholars, soldiers, and merchants alike. Entire households drifted into quiet ruin. Productivity declined. Families spent their savings on the substance. And more silver left the country. The Chinese government grew increasingly alarmed. Silver was the backbone of its economy, essential for paying soldiers, maintaining granaries, and keeping the massive bureaucracy running. As silver drained away, taxes faltered. Local economies strained. Prices fluctuated wildly. Imagine the soft creak of an accountant's brush across paper, writing numbers that suddenly no longer balanced. Imagine a local governor staring at empty coffers, feeling a slow, heavy dread settle into his chest. Those moments, quiet, private moments, marked the beginning of a national crisis. Still, the flow continued. British traders saw profits rise beyond imagination. Their ships left Indian ports loaded with opium bricks, carefully wrapped, branded with distinctive logos, stacked in neat, fragrant rows. And they returned from China with bales of tea, crates of porcelain, and precious silk, all paid for by silver that once strengthened the Qing Dynasty. Every barrel of opium sold represented one more thread tugged out of the fabric of the empire. And the people? The people drifted deeper into dependency. In tea houses and small rooms hidden behind shops, smokers reclined on bamboo beds, their pipes glowing softly, smoke curling into the air like thin, ghostly ribbons. The world blurred, pain softened, worries faded. But the cost was staggering. Families lost their savings. Workers abandoned their jobs. Local communities weakened as able-bodied men disappeared into slow, hazy afternoons. The once strong social structure of China, the balance, discipline, and harmony began to wobble. And yet, outside the imperial capital, the problem still seemed distant. The emperor received only fragments of truth. Scholars debated the issue in calm voices, unsure whether to blame the merchants, the government, or the people themselves. The crisis had not fully erupted yet, but the seeds had been planted. Quietly, softly, under the cover of trade. This was the moment when history began to tilt. The beginning of the decline, sparked not by war or rebellion, but by a substance carried in wooden chests across a vast, shimmering ocean. And all the while, the silver, the lifeblood of the empire, continued to slip away like water through open fingers. The fog of opium was spreading slowly across China, creeping into towns, villages, and bustling port cities alike. Imagine the quiet hum of daily life, the soft clatter of market stalls, and the laughter of children playing in narrow alleys. Behind the calm veneer, an invisible threat was weaving its way through the fabric of society. By the early 1800s, opium smoking had become more than a novelty. It was a growing epidemic. Initially confined to southern ports such as Canton and Xiamen, the habit spread inland along rivers and trade routes, reaching towns where merchants had never before tasted the bitter resin. Families that once prospered now spent silver coins they could scarcely afford on a fleeting escape, a temporary warmth, a momentary calm from the harshness of everyday life. The Qing officials were growing increasingly uneasy. Reports flowed into Beijing detailing the swelling tide of addiction. Governors in southern provinces sent letters describing opium dens tucked into the corners of tea houses, traders spending entire fortunes on the drug, and young men who had abandoned their apprenticeships for the haze of smoke. Yet, despite these warnings, the government was slow to act. Bureaucracy moved with the lethargy of a river in winter, weighed down by inertia, tradition, and corruption. The emperor, secluded in the Forbidden City, could only receive filtered reports. Couriers brought ink-stained documents filled with numbers and letters that painted a confusing picture. How much opium was truly entering the empire? How many silver coins were leaving? How deeply had families and communities been affected? The answers were shrouded, obscured by distance, deception, and fear of reprisal. Meanwhile, British merchants took advantage of this indecision. The East India Company, well aware of the empire's reliance on silver, increased shipments of opium from India, carefully calculated to maximize profit while minimizing attention. Large crates were hidden under tea, disguised as mundane goods, or stored in offshore warehouses beyond the immediate reach of Chinese authorities. Smugglers navigated rivers and coastal channels at night, lanterns dim, their movements silent and precise. The operation was meticulous, almost surgical. A shadow war played out in the dark. Local officials found themselves trapped. Some attempted to resist, imposing fines or confiscating shipments, but the lure of bribes was strong. In a province where authority was fragmented, where wealth could be gained in a single night of turning a blind eye, corruption thrived. Even ordinary villagers, seduced by the promises of wealth or relief from hardship, became part of the chain that allowed opium to infiltrate deeper into society. Imagine walking through the streets of Canton during this period. The air is thick with the aroma of incense and cooking fires, mingled faintly with the sweet, dried flesh of opium. Bitter scent of burning opium. Merchants call out their wares. Children dodge between legs of busy buyers. And amid this, quiet smoke curls from hidden rooms. Those inside recline on bamboo chairs, the glow of their pipes illuminating faces etched with both pleasure and quiet despair. The city pulses with life above ground, but beneath it, a creeping dependence gnaws at the people. By 1820, the social consequences became undeniable. Work productivity declined. Craftsmen and laborers found their mornings delayed, afternoons hazy with drowsiness, and nights spent chasing the fleeting relief that opium provided. Families, once stable and thriving, began to crumble. Household silver, the essential measure of wealth, vanished into thin air, leaving cupboards bare and futures uncertain. Even local merchants, once respected, found themselves caught in the addictive cycle, their businesses faltering as debts mounted. The cultural impact was subtle but deep. Traditional ceremonies, which had once marked seasons and milestones, were disrupted. Festivals became smaller, quieter, less spirited. Temples, which had served as centers of moral guidance and communal cohesion, saw fewer visitors, as some devotees lost themselves to the persistent haze. Scholars, responsible for the continuity of education and administration, succumbed to smoke-filled rooms and trembling hands, unable to maintain focus. The empire's very intellectual backbone began to bend. And yet, the Qing leadership remained uncertain. Some viewed the opium trade as a minor nuisance, believing it confined to the southern provinces. Others, aware of the growing crisis, debated strategies. Should opium be banned outright? Should officials increase enforcement and punishment? Or was it too deeply embedded in society to eradicate without significant social disruption? Every potential solution seemed fraught with risk, and hesitation became the empire's invisible enemy. The economic ramifications were equally severe. Silver, now flowing out in unprecedented quantities, weakened the government's ability to maintain essential services. Military forces, dependent on stable finances, found themselves underfunded. Grain storage for famine prevention lacked resources. Tax collection became unreliable as village officials succumbed to bribery or neglect. Each missing coin from the imperial coffers amplified the vulnerability of an empire that had once seemed unassailable. Amid all of this, the human cost was profound. Picture a small family in a southern town. The father spends his earnings on opium. The mother struggles to feed the children, and the youngest sleeps amid the scent of smoke drifting through the room. Hours pass, and the cycle repeats. Day after day, week after week, children witness the slow decay of household stability. Young adults grow into addiction. The society's continuity, previously guaranteed by centuries of disciplined structure, begins to fray. And yet, there were glimmers of resistance. Some officials, brave and morally upright, attempted to enforce laws against opium trading. They confiscated shipments, punished smugglers, and warned merchants of the consequences. Their efforts, though noble, were isolated and often countered by bribery, intimidation, or sheer logistical impossibility. The battle was not fought with armies or cannons, but with diligence, courage, and unwavering principle against the tide of profit and addiction. Meanwhile, merchants in Britain watched the unfolding scene with detached calculation. Each ship departing for China carried the promise of unprecedented wealth. Calculations were precise. Every chest of opium sold, every ounce of silver returned, every bale of tea acquired, all meticulously accounted for. To the traders, it was business. To the empire, it was the beginning of a profound unraveling. And so, the Qing Dynasty, at its heart still powerful, continued to drift. The opium trade became more than just a commercial activity. It was a slow erosion of authority, culture, and economy. Like water carving through stone, the impact was quiet but unstoppable. By the time the imperial court fully recognized the severity of the crisis, opium had entrenched itself so deeply that no single action could reverse the flow. Families, officials, and communities continued their quiet suffering. Silver left the country, dependence grew, corruption spread, and the empire, which had once stood as a model of civilization, began a long, slow decline that would eventually invite foreign intervention, internal rebellion, and social upheaval. Period. By the late 1820s, the Qing court could no longer ignore the creeping tide of opium and the relentless outflow of silver. The reality of the empire's decline was becoming unmistakable, visible even from the secluded halls of the Forbidden City. Courtiers whispered anxiously about the epidemic that had quietly undermined authority, drained the treasury, and corrupted officials across countless provinces. The empire that once radiated confidence now found itself vulnerable, teetering on the precipice of internal and external pressures. The emperor, surrounded by advisors and ministers, convened urgent meetings. Scrolls were spread across lacquered tables, detailing shipments intercepted at ports, trade routes discovered by spies, and the growing prevalence of addiction in towns far from the coast. While the reports were detailed, they were also overwhelming. Numbers blurred together, estimates conflicted, and the true scale of the crisis remained difficult to grasp. The court faced a monumental dilemma: how to preserve authority without sparking widespread social unrest. In the southern provinces, determined officials took more direct action. They organized raids on opium dens, confiscated chests of the drug, and prosecuted smugglers with severity. Enforcement teams patrolled rivers and canals, searching for secret cargo. Yet these brave interventions were often undermined by corruption. Many officials, faced with bribes larger than their annual salaries, found it impossible to resist. The empire's own mechanisms of control were compromised, creating pockets of lawlessness in otherwise orderly regions. Across the cities and villages, the human toll continued to rise. Families, desperate and destitute, struggled to maintain basic livelihoods, while the grip of addiction tightened. Fathers who once labored diligently in fields or workshops found their days consumed by smoke and craving. Mothers, exhausted and anxious, worked tirelessly to stretch meager resources for their children, often witnessing the slow decay of health and morale. Children, growing up in the haze, learned early of loss, struggle, and despair. Communities that had flourished under the king's stability were now shadows of their former selves. Amid this chaos, social unrest began to stir. Small rebellions and localized uprisings emerged as villagers resisted both the opium trade and the corrupt officials enforcing or ignoring the law. Some communities tried to combat opium collectively, organizing patrols or educating their youth on the dangers of addiction. Yet the sheer scale of the epidemic made these efforts feel like drops in an endless river. The empire's infrastructure, once capable of maintaining law and order over vast distances, was now tested to its limits. The economic consequences became impossible to ignore. Silver, which had long been the lifeblood of the empire, now flowed outward at alarming rates. Provinces that relied on tax revenue to fund grain storage, public works, and military defense suddenly faced shortages. Military garrisons were left underfunded, unable to respond effectively to local disturbances. Officials tasked with famine relief struggled to secure supplies. The combination of fiscal strain, social unrest, and widespread addiction created a precarious balance, where one misstep could ignite crisis on multiple fronts. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar official renowned for his integrity and diligence, to spearhead a comprehensive campaign against opium. Lin approached the problem with meticulous planning and unwavering determination. He wrote letters to provincial governors, urging them to support confiscation efforts, and appealed to merchants to cease importing opium. His speeches, imbued with moral authority, warned of the dire consequences if the empire failed to act decisively. Yet Lin's mission was daunting. Entrenched interests, the sheer volume of smuggling, and the reliance of some local economies on the opium trade created nearly insurmountable obstacles. In 1839, Lin took a bold and symbolic step. He organized the confiscation and destruction of more than 20,000 chests of opium in Canton. The chests were publicly burned on the shores of the Pearl River, sending plumes of smoke skyward a stark declaration of imperial authority. The act was both courageous and provocative, signaling to the British merchants that China would no longer tolerate the trade. Crowds gathered to witness the spectacle, a mixture of awe, fear, and silent hope flickering across their faces. The destruction of the opium was not merely a practical measure. It was a psychological message, an attempt to reclaim control over a society slipping into moral and economic decay. Yet, the destruction also had unintended consequences. British traders, outraged by the seizure, lobbied their government for protection and retaliation. Diplomats and military advisors, seeing opportunity and insult intertwined, prepared to project force across the oceans. The first ripples of what would become the Opium War were already forming, far from the smoke and bamboo of China's southern ports. A confrontation seemed inevitable, where not just opium, but sovereignty, trade, and national pride would collide in violent conflict. Meanwhile, within China, the population continued to grapple with the human cost of the epidemic. Addiction persisted among those untouched by confiscations. Families struggled to maintain order. Villages tried to resist, and officials faced impossible moral and logistical challenges. The empire, still mighty in appearance, was increasingly fragile in substance, a tension between external strength and internal vulnerability. Sleep history narration would linger on the quiet tragedies, a father's trembling hands as he tries to resist the pipe, a mother weeping quietly over a child's wasted health, a merchant counting coins that vanish as quickly as they are earned. These intimate details, slow-paced and atmospheric, reveal the human side of systemic crisis. The looming war and the continued drain of silver set the stage for profound transformations. The Qing Dynasty, once a symbol of stability, would confront foreign powers with unprecedented technology, naval firepower, and tactical discipline. Internally, the social fabric strained to breaking point, highlighting weaknesses that had been hidden for generations. The opium crisis, initially a trade issue, had evolved into a fundamental test of governance, resilience, and the empire's ability to adapt to a changing world. By the early 1840s, the opium epidemic had firmly entrenched itself across China, reaching far beyond the southern ports and penetrating towns, villages, and even the interiors of prosperous cities. What had started as a trade commodity for the elite now seeped into every corner of society. Merchants, scholars, laborers, farmers, and artisans alike found themselves drawn into its smoky embrace. No social class could claim immunity. The sprawling empire, long known for its meticulous record-keeping and disciplined bureaucracy, now faced a more insidious threat, one that quietly eroded its strength from within. In bustling city streets, the subtle signs were everywhere. Shopkeepers, once diligent in counting coins and managing inventory, began arriving late, distracted, or entirely absent from their stalls. Craftsmen, responsible for producing intricate works of porcelain, silk, and bronze, now struggled to maintain focus. Their hands, once steady and precise, trembled from the grip of addiction, and delicate mistakes marred what had previously been flawless creations. The rhythmic sounds of hammers, looms, and chisels that had echoed through marketplaces now fell into irregular pauses, punctuated by coughs and lethargic movements. Among farmers, the consequences were equally stark. Fields that had flourished under careful tending became uneven. Weeds sprouted unchecked, and irrigation channels fell into disrepair. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, the backbone of rural life, was disrupted. Villagers found themselves exhausted, unable to labor for long hours, their eyes glazed and their energy sapped. Families struggled to feed themselves as the toil required to maintain fertile land became overwhelming. Productivity declined, not due to natural disaster or foreign invasion, but because human will was being sapped by the constant, quiet presence of opium. Page. The social fabric of China began to fray. Family dynamics changed as addiction disrupted traditional hierarchies. Fathers who had been providers found themselves dependent on their own indulgences. Mothers carried the burden of sustaining households while also contending with the shame and secrecy surrounding their husbands' habits. And children bore witness to these struggles in ways that would leave lasting emotional scars. Household routines, once predictable and stable, descended into disorder. Meals were skipped or poorly prepared, chores left undone, and communal traditions waned under the weight of neglect. The daily cadence of life, the backbone of stability, began to stutter. Opium dens, once a novelty in port cities, proliferated in urban centers, each filled with the muted haze of smoke curling lazily into the air. Patrons reclined on low couches, fingers stained yellow, eyes half-lidded, absorbed in private clouds of oblivion. The atmosphere was deceptively serene, yet beneath the surface lay a complex network of despair and decline. Social hierarchies began to shift as addiction eroded the distinction between laborer and elite, rich and poor, moral and indulgent. Those who once had command over their surroundings found themselves slaves to a persistent craving, a subtle but relentless master. Artisans who once took pride in their craft began to produce substandard goods. The intricacy of a carved jade figurine or the delicate stitching of silk robes suffered as their focus faltered. Misalignments, broken threads, and flawed finishes became increasingly common. These imperfections were not merely technical. They reflected the slow erosion of discipline and precision, hallmarks of a society once deeply committed to excellence and order. As these errors accumulated, so did the impact on trade, commerce, and cultural pride. Markets that had relied on China's reputation for meticulous craftsmanship experienced subtle yet growing declines in confidence. Communities suffered not only from labor reduction, but also from the moral questions that arose. Villagers debated the ethics of allowing young men and women to fall under the influence, discussing responsibilities to neighbors, extended family, and the empire itself. Public opinion began to polarize. Some advocated strict prohibition. Others found themselves reluctantly complicit, selling small amounts to maintain economic stability. The debate, slow and reflective, seeped into every household, emphasizing the pervasive influence of addiction on both personal and collective morality. As these changes unfolded, the empire's leaders observed the creeping social decay with unease. Reports from provincial governors detailed rising absenteeism, declining tax revenue, and the increasing number of accidents in workshops and fields. Civil servants struggled to implement policies as the workforce faltered. The disruption was not violent, not immediately catastrophic, but the accumulation of small failures threatened long-term stability. Sleep history narration would linger on these quiet details. A weaver dropping a delicate thread in despair. A farmer pausing to cough while watching crops wilt. A mother whispering a prayer over children too young to understand the loss of routine. These scenes, atmospheric and reflective, illustrate the human dimension of societal collapse. Despite these challenges, pockets of resilience persisted. Families, communities, and officials attempted to counteract the spread of opium with education, moral instruction, and legal enforcement. Villagers held gatherings to encourage abstinence, emphasizing the long-term benefits of sobriety and discipline. Artisans sought mentorship from those unaffected, sharing skills and techniques to preserve cultural integrity. However, the magnitude of the epidemic, combined with systemic corruption and entrenched habits, made these interventions difficult. The empire was caught in a subtle tug-of-war, where every small victory seemed shadowed by the omnipresent influence of addiction. As opium continued its quiet conquest, the once orderly rhythms of Chinese society began to fray further, touching corners of life that few could escape. Artisans who had survived Part 1 now found themselves struggling not only with focus and precision, but also with collaboration. Workshops and guilds, previously structured around shared skill and meticulous scheduling, now faced absenteeism, delays, and disputes. The subtle cohesion that had enabled communities to thrive was weakening, replaced by disarray and frustration. Each missed deadline, each flawed product, each delay in delivery became a small but cumulative strain on the economy and social trust. In urban households, addiction introduced new dynamics that challenged the fabric of family life. Husbands who once provided steadily now often squandered earnings in the pursuit of opium, leaving wives to manage both household and finances under extreme stress. Children became silent witnesses to tensions and neglect, their routines disrupted by parents who could no longer maintain regular schedules. School attendance faltered, lessons were interrupted, and communal learning suffered. The young, exposed to addiction in subtle and pervasive ways, absorbed habits, attitudes, and anxieties that would shape their own future behaviors. Outside the cities, rural life fared no better. Villagers struggled to maintain crops, repair infrastructure, and keep livestock healthy. Fields, once carefully tended, displayed uneven growth. Irrigation channels and dikes required attention that few could provide. Farmers, fatigued by long hours and compromised by addiction, could not sustain productivity. Family farms, pillars of local stability and food security, began to falter. Seasonal rhythms, essential to survival and planning, were disrupted. Even minor illnesses, which in previous generations might have been manageable, now grew more threatening due to weakened attention and diminished care. Opium's influence reached social rituals and public gatherings. Festivals, communal meals, and religious observances lost their energy and cohesion. Where once there had been collective joy and purpose, now apathy and distraction prevailed. The atmosphere was not chaotic in a dramatic sense, but subdued, reflective, and ominously quiet. Leaders noticed the subtle shifts in participation, the lack of enthusiasm, the irregular attendance at public events. These small absences accumulated into a noticeable decline in community engagement and morale. Economic consequences extended beyond individual households. Merchants dependent on reliable production found shipments delayed or defective, trade routes disrupted, and market confidence eroding. Craftsmen's mistakes meant losses in competitive international markets, where quality and reputation were paramount. These economic tremors rippled outward, straining relations with trading partners and undermining local economies. The empire, long a hub of sophisticated trade, began to show cracks that were subtle yet consequential, exacerbating vulnerabilities that foreign powers were quick to notice. Meanwhile, government officials faced mounting challenges. Reports from provincial administrators chronicled rising absenteeism, dwindling tax collections, and sporadic uprisings fueled by desperation. Bureaucrats attempted enforcement of anti-opium measures, but corruption and local complicity undermined efforts. Smugglers and merchants adeptly navigated regulations, exploiting loopholes and bribing officials to maintain operations. policy and enforcement became a cat-and-mouse game, further weakening faith in leadership and diminishing social cohesion. Observers, writing detailed accounts, described not violent collapse, but an invisible erosion of authority, one subtle policy at a time. Among the social elite, opium consumption carried distinct implications. Scholars, bureaucrats, and members of the gentry found their decision-making and study practices impaired. The meticulous observation, critical thinking, and ethical deliberation required for leadership were undermined by indulgence. Meetings that once resulted in coherent plans and effective governance now ended in confusion or delay. Philosophical and ethical debates, central to the cultural and moral life of the empire, were sometimes abandoned in favor of quiet indulgence. Knowledge, once the currency of power, was compromised by addiction's silent persistence. Cultural impacts were equally profound. Artists, writers, and musicians found their inspiration clouded. Paintings took longer to complete. Manuscripts remained unfinished, and music lost its precision and rhythm. The moral conversation within communities intensified. Families, neighbors, and local leaders wrestled with questions of accountability, prevention, and intervention. How could a society prevent its members from succumbing to indulgence? Should enforcement be strict or lenient? How could economic survival be balanced against moral responsibility? These debates, contemplative and ongoing, reflected the empire's struggle to reconcile human desire with societal order. While the narrative of catastrophe remained slow-moving, each decision, each discussion, each act of indulgence or restraint had long-term implications. In the quiet, dimly lit streets of Qing cities, the lingering effects of opium addiction had begun to reshape daily life. Markets that were once bustling with activity now moved at a lethargic pace. Shopkeepers, slow to open their stalls, struggled to maintain their inventories and often forgot orders placed by regular customers. Street hawkers, who had previously called out their wares with energy and clarity, now murmured softly, their attention easily distracted by craving or fatigue. The vibrancy of commerce, once the heartbeat of urban centers, ebbed away like water from a slowly draining river. Families continued to bear the weight of addiction's influence. Children, increasingly responsible for tasks that their parents had neglected, assumed household duties far beyond their years. They carried water, tended small vegetable plots, and ensured younger siblings were fed and clothed. While these responsibilities built resilience, they also imposed stress and anxiety that would follow them into adulthood. Parental neglect, often subtle and interspersed with brief moments of attention, created unpredictable environments. Children learned to navigate the complexities of survival in homes fractured by addiction, observing patterns of indulgence and deprivation that would silently shape their moral and practical judgment. Workshops and guilds, which had begun to falter in Part 2, now showed further signs of strain. Master craftsmen struggled to supervise apprentices, and quality control faltered. Defective goods accumulated, and orders were frequently delayed. Competitions with neighboring regions or foreign traders highlighted these deficiencies, putting additional pressure on an already taxed labor force. Industrial productivity, limited though it was in 19th century Qing cities, could not withstand the combination of distraction, indulgence, and chronic fatigue. Even minor errors had cascading consequences, undermining confidence and slowing economic recovery. Opium's reach extended to public ceremonies and communal events, which now felt subdued and strained. Festivals, previously marked by music, dance, and ritual, proceeded with diminished energy. Observers noted a lack of participation, muted responses, and absent-minded engagement. Religious and civic leaders attempted to preserve tradition, but their messages were often met with indifference. The social glue that had historically bonded communities was now stretched thin, weakened by the pervasive distraction of addiction. In rural areas, the slow decline continued as well. Farmers and laborers, already battling the elements, diseases, and economic uncertainty, now faced an invisible adversary within their own homes. Daily chores were neglected, crops received uneven attention, and livestock suffered from inconsistent care. Villagers, who had once relied on cooperative efforts, found collaboration eroded as neighbors wrestled with their own personal struggles. The subtle, cumulative effect of this behavioral disruption had long-term consequences on agricultural output, food security, and community resilience. The Qing administration, aware of these growing internal pressures, found itself ill-equipped to respond. Corruption and inefficiency compounded the challenges. Officials, some complicit, others overwhelmed, struggled to enforce anti-opium policies. Attempts at regulation, raids, fines, and confiscations met with mixed success, often delayed or circumvented. The empire's machinery, which had previously maintained order and oversight, now creaked under the weight of bureaucratic limitations and widespread human weakness. Intellectual and cultural life continued its subtle decay. Scholars, poets, and artists faced diminished productivity, losing inspiration and focus to addiction. Manuscripts remained unfinished, paintings incomplete, and music lost the harmony it once carried. Communities that had thrived on rigorous scholarship and careful artistic endeavor now observed a decline that was quiet but profound. Knowledge, once carefully curated and passed through disciplined apprenticeships, was eroding, leaving gaps in intellectual continuity. Students struggled to learn, teachers struggled to teach, and the cumulative effect on cultural transmission was significant. Medical concerns compounded social instability. Families neglected minor illnesses until they became severe, and hospitals, already scarce, faced overcrowding and shortages of skilled personnel. Traditional remedies were often applied inconsistently, while Western medicine, still in its infancy, reached few. Epidemics of minor diseases spread faster in these distracted, uncoordinated communities. In these moments, the subtle horror of opium's indirect consequences became painfully visible. Not immediate death or violence, but the quiet erosion of health, morale, and social structure. The moral and philosophical debates surrounding opium continued, both publicly and privately. Families, communities, and officials questioned the balance between individual indulgence and societal welfare. Conversations often circled around themes of responsibility, ethical governance, and personal restraint. The empire was, in essence, engaged in an unspoken struggle against a silent, insidious force that sapped human energy and undermined collective order. Observers recorded these debates in diaries, letters, and reports, leaving a historical footprint of contemplation, worry, and moral inquiry. In the early 19th century, a tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades finally erupted into open conflict. The British Empire, fueled by its growing trade ambitions and a relentless demand for Chinese tea, found itself at odds with the Qing Dynasty, which sought to preserve its sovereignty and protect its people from the devastating effects of opium. The clash was not only economic, but technological. Britain, with its industrialized economy and modern naval power, possessed gunboats, cannons, and military strategies far beyond what the Qing forces could muster. China, despite its long history of innovation and cultural sophistication, had relied on outdated naval defenses. Wooden junks with little armor faced the powerful, ironclad British vessels. When the first confrontations began along the South China coast, the imbalance was immediately apparent. Shots fired from modern cannons tore through traditional fortifications with alarming ease. The Chinese soldiers, brave and disciplined, fought valiantly, but they were no match for the firepower and strategic organization of the British forces. The First Opium War, which began in 1839, was triggered by the Chinese government's crackdown on opium smuggling. The destruction of opium stocks in Canton, led by Commissioner Lin Zexu, was a bold statement against the influx of the drug and its social consequences. Yet, it also provided the British with a pretext to escalate military engagement. The Qing Dynasty had hoped diplomacy could resolve the issue, but the British were determined to protect their economic interests, insisting that trade must continue and opium must flow freely. As the war progressed, several key battles demonstrated the overwhelming advantage of the British. Coastal cities fell quickly under naval bombardment, and inland fortresses were often outmaneuvered. British gunboats moved swiftly up rivers, bypassing heavy walls that might have once deterred attackers. Communication and coordination among the Chinese military were hindered by outdated systems, while British forces employed disciplined chains of command and coordinated assaults that capitalized on speed and firepower. The human toll of these conflicts was significant. Civilians in port cities suffered greatly as battles raged around them. Homes were damaged, marketplaces disrupted, and lives upended. Families who had once enjoyed stability found themselves caught in the crossfire of a war that was not of their making. Meanwhile, the British, although technologically superior, also faced challenges, navigating unfamiliar waters, maintaining long supply lines, and dealing with resistance from local militias and villagers. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the Opium Wars set the stage for profound political and social changes. The Qing Dynasty, forced to negotiate under duress, agreed to treaties that favored British interests. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was the first of several unequal treaties that ceded territory, opened ports for foreign trade, and imposed financial reparations on China. The city of Hong Kong was handed to Britain, and several coastal cities became treaty ports where Chinese law was restricted in favor of British jurisdiction. These concessions shocked many in China, who had long viewed their empire as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. The sudden exposure to foreign military and economic power revealed the fragility of even the most ancient and established institutions. Citizens, scholars, and officials alike struggled to reconcile the image of their nation as powerful and unassailable with the reality of a humbled state forced to accept foreign demands. Even in this time of conflict, life continued in the cities and countryside. Farmers tended their fields as best they could. Merchants attempted to maintain trade despite the disruptions, and families sought moments of calm amid uncertainty. These human stories, quiet acts of resilience, persistence, and adaptation, were as much a part of the era as the battles themselves. Through their eyes, one can see the profound impact of the Opium Wars on everyday life. The fear, the uncertainty, and the gradual reshaping of social norms and expectations. The Opium Wars were not merely military confrontations. They were a stark demonstration of industrial and technological disparities. Britain's ability to project power across oceans, sustain long-term campaigns, and leverage advanced weaponry underscored the emerging global hierarchy of the 19th century. China's initial underestimation of foreign capabilities, coupled with internal inefficiencies, magnified the consequences of the conflict. By the conclusion of the First War, it was clear that the Qing Dynasty would face a difficult path ahead. The lessons of the battlefield were unavoidable. Modernization was no longer optional, and engagement with foreign powers carried both opportunities and risks. The unequal treaties imposed upon China were a bitter pill, yet they also sparked debates within Chinese society about reform, governance, and the necessity of understanding global dynamics. In the quiet aftermath of battle, as smoke cleared over the devastated port cities and the waters of the South China Sea settled into stillness, the people of China were left to confront the stark reality of a changing world. The Opium Wars, seemingly a clash of armies, had ripple effects that extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping trade, law, society, and the very psyche of a nation. Even as the Qing rulers contemplated their next moves, the British pressed forward, determined to maintain dominance over trade routes and economic leverage. The combination of military superiority and strategic diplomacy ensured that the lessons of the Opium Wars would not be quickly forgotten. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were immediate: disrupted lives, altered economies, and the creeping awareness that the world outside China was far more powerful and connected than previously imagined. By examining the first stage of these conflicts, one can begin to understand the enormous pressure on the Qing Dynasty, the courage and resilience of its people, and the broader forces of history that were reshaping nations across the globe. The Opium Wars were both a crisis and a catalyst, a harsh reminder of vulnerability and an impetus for eventual transformation.
As the Opium Wars dragged on, the imbalance between British and Chinese forces became increasingly clear. The Qing Dynasty faced not only external pressure from a technologically superior foe, but also internal strain as provinces struggled to maintain law and order. The wars highlighted the vast gulf in industrial capabilities between East and West, a gap that would influence Chinese policy and society for decades to come. Britain's military strategy relied on mobility, concentrated firepower, and intimidation. Gunboats patrolled rivers and estuaries with precision, cutting off supply lines and preventing the Chinese from mounting effective counterattacks. The Qing forces, in contrast, were constrained by traditional defensive tactics, limited artillery, and logistical challenges. Many Chinese commanders found themselves unprepared for the speed and range of British naval operations. Attempts to fortify coastal cities often failed, as cannons were no match for iron-hulled vessels and long-range bombardments. The human impact of the wars extended far beyond the battlefield. Coastal populations endured relentless disruption. Farmers' crops were destroyed, marketplaces were abandoned, and local trade collapsed under the weight of conflict. Families who had once relied on the steady rhythm of rural life were suddenly vulnerable to violence and famine. Scholars and officials, long accustomed to orderly administration, faced chaos, corruption, and difficult decisions about survival and loyalty. One of the most striking aspects of the conflict was the psychological toll. The Qing people, who had considered themselves the center of a world steeped in tradition, civilization, and sophistication, now confronted the stark reality of foreign dominance. The shock of seeing cities reduced to rubble, naval fleets operating with precision, and treaties signed under duress left a lasting impression on the national consciousness. Children grew up hearing tales of invasion and loss, while merchants and artisans adjusted to a new, unpredictable economic landscape. Despite these hardships, life continued. Ordinary citizens found ways to adapt. In coastal towns, families relocated to safer inland areas, carrying with them the few possessions they could salvage. Market vendors improvised, trading goods under the threat of inspection or seizure by occupying forces. Religious and community leaders offered guidance, attempting to preserve a sense of normalcy and continuity amidst upheaval. These small acts of resilience were testament to human endurance, even in times of crisis. The British, while dominating militarily, were also careful to establish control over trade and governance. The Treaty of Nanking, enforced after key battles, required China to pay substantial indemnities, opened several ports to foreign trade, and ceded Hong Kong to Britain. The imposition of these conditions was humiliating, yet strategically advantageous for the British, who now enjoyed unprecedented access to Chinese markets. The unequal nature of these treaties sowed seeds of resentment that would influence Sino-Western relations for generations. As the Qing Dynasty reeled under the pressure, local militias attempted to resist. Villages organized volunteer forces, and regional leaders sought to defend communities from both foreign troops and domestic opportunists. These efforts, while often courageous, were hampered by limited training, outdated weapons, and fragmented command structures. The contrast between local valor and imperial vulnerability underscored the systemic weaknesses within the Qing administration. The Opium Wars also highlighted the intersection of commerce and conflict. British merchants and traders, motivated by profit, leveraged their nation's military superiority to secure favorable terms, while Chinese officials struggled to balance moral and economic imperatives. The opium trade itself had devastated communities, draining silver from the economy, corrupting officials, and undermining social stability. In this way, commerce was not just a backdrop to war, but a driving force, shaping decisions and influencing outcomes on both sides. Cultural and intellectual reactions to the wars were profound. Scholars debated the causes and consequences, reflecting on China's place in the emerging global order. Some advocated for reform and modernization, arguing that engagement with Western technology and governance could prevent future humiliations. Others resisted change, emphasizing tradition, sovereignty, and the importance of moral authority. This tension between reform and conservatism would dominate Chinese thought for the remainder of the century. Amid the military campaigns, ordinary daily life continued, albeit disrupted. Children learned lessons by candlelight as schools struggled to operate. Merchants devised new trade routes and barter systems. Farmers adjusted planting schedules to avoid areas of conflict. In towns that escaped direct bombardment, life carried on with an uneasy sense of normalcy. Yet the shadow of war was ever present, shaping behavior, decisions, and expectations in ways that would resonate long after the treaties were signed. Medical care during the Opium Wars was rudimentary, with both combatants and civilians suffering from disease, injury, and lack of adequate treatment. Battlefield injuries, combined with pre-existing conditions, led to high mortality rates. Infections, poor sanitation, and malnutrition exacerbated the already dire circumstances. Families often had to improvise care, using traditional remedies and limited resources to tend to the wounded and sick. By the conclusion of the first phase of hostilities, it became evident that the Opium Wars were more than a military confrontation. They were a catalyst for profound societal transformation. China's defeat exposed systemic weaknesses, revealed technological disparities and ignited debates over governance, modernization, and foreign engagement. Meanwhile, Britain consolidated economic and strategic advantages, establishing precedents for future interactions in the region. The calm narration of daily life amidst these turbulent events provides a lens through which to understand the period. Beyond the smoke of battle and the imposition of treaties, ordinary people continued to live, adapt, and persevere. These narratives of resilience, innovation, and endurance are as critical to understanding the Opium Wars as the military and diplomatic history itself. As the Qing leadership contemplated the future, the lessons were clear. The world beyond China's borders had changed irrevocably. To survive and thrive, the empire would need to confront its own internal deficiencies, embrace technological and administrative reform, and navigate a complex international landscape. The consequences of failing to do so were already apparent, as regions struggled with the twin pressures of foreign domination and domestic instability. Through this lens, the Opium Wars can be seen not merely as a clash of armies, but as a turning point in the history of modern China. They revealed the vulnerabilities of even the most ancient institutions, highlighted the costs of isolation, and underscored the interdependence of commerce, technology, and trade, and governance in shaping national destiny. The lessons from these years would echo across decades, influencing reform movements, rebellions, and the eventual transformation of the Qing Dynasty into a more modern state. As the First Opium War drew to a close, the Qing Dynasty faced the sobering reality of foreign dominance and internal vulnerability. The conflict had exposed fundamental weaknesses in military strategy, technological capability, and administrative cohesion. While treaties were signed and ports opened to trade, the societal consequences of defeat reverberated across the empire. Families, communities, and officials all struggled to adjust to the new realities imposed by foreign powers. The unequal treaties that concluded the war served as both a legal and symbolic acknowledgement of Chinese subjugation. Cities like Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, and Fuzhou were forced to allow foreign trade. Foreign consuls established residence, and tariffs were adjusted in favor of Western merchants. These measures were designed to create long-term economic leverage, and they succeeded, gradually eroding China's ability to control its own commerce. Local economies adapted to these pressures with mixed results. Some merchants prospered by engaging with foreign traders, while others were displaced, facing ruin due to the sudden influx of Western goods and the disruption of traditional markets. The Opium Wars accelerated a period of moral and cultural dislocation. Opium addiction, already prevalent before hostilities, surged in the aftermath, further destabilizing communities. Labor productivity declined as artisans, farmers, and merchants struggled to maintain their livelihoods. The psychological impact was significant. Witnessing foreign military power firsthand and experiencing imposed laws and trade policies challenged long-held notions of Chinese superiority and self-sufficiency. Education and intellectual life also suffered disruptions. Scholars, who had long been the backbone of imperial governance, found themselves navigating unfamiliar legal frameworks and adjusting curricula to incorporate awareness of Western technologies and political systems. Some advocated for a selective adoption of Western knowledge, military innovations, navigational science, and industrial techniques, believing that such adaptations were necessary to preserve sovereignty. Others resisted, emphasizing the importance of tradition, Confucian ethics, and the inherent superiority of Chinese culture. This ideological tension would shape reform debates for decades to come. The impact on daily life extended beyond the cities. Rural areas, while physically removed from bombardments, were nonetheless affected by supply disruptions, forced labor, and population displacement. Farmers faced shortages of seed, livestock losses, and the constant threat of requisitioning by military forces. Villagers who had once lived in relative isolation now contended with new economic pressures, taxation, and the lingering presence of foreign influence through trade networks. Health and medicine remained precarious. Casualties from the war were compounded by ongoing diseases, malnutrition, and limited access to effective treatment. Families improvised with herbal remedies, traditional acupuncture, and other indigenous practices, attempting to maintain the health of both soldiers and civilians. The psychological toll of constant threat and uncertainty contributed to fatigue, depression, and a pervasive sense of instability. Cultural identity, too, was challenged. Art, literature, and performance began reflecting a mix of traditional values and responses to foreign intrusion. Storytellers incorporated narratives of heroism, loss, and resilience, while visual arts depicted both the devastation of conflict and the enduring strength of local communities. These creative expressions allowed the population to process trauma and maintain a connection to heritage, even as external pressures demanded adaptation. On the diplomatic front, the Qing leadership faced immense pressure to negotiate effectively with Western powers. Delegations to British representatives, conducted under the shadow of military inferiority, revealed the delicate balance between concession and resistance. Officials struggled with the moral and practical implications of treaty agreements, while regional governors attempted to maintain order amidst confusion and resentment among their populations. Economically, the long-term consequences of the Opium Wars were profound. The influx of foreign goods disrupted local industries, undermined traditional trade networks, and exposed weaknesses in taxation and revenue collection. Silver outflow continued, fueled by opium trade, creating financial instability. Families that had relied on agriculture and artisanal crafts now faced new market forces beyond their control. Some adapted, seeking employment in port cities or engaging in new industries, while others experienced impoverishment and social decline. Despite the chaos, resilience persisted. Communities developed informal support networks. Neighbors assisted each other in times of scarcity, and cultural institutions, temples, guilds, and local councils continued to provide guidance and a sense of continuity. Ordinary people navigated a complex web of foreign influence, domestic policy, and local survival, demonstrating adaptability and endurance under pressure. The Opium Wars also prompted reflection within the imperial court. Leaders debated the need for military modernization, investment in naval and artillery technology, and reform of bureaucratic practices. Some proposals emphasized learning from Western advances while preserving core Chinese values, a strategy that would gradually shape the self-strengthening movement later in the century. The recognition that isolation could no longer guarantee security marked a turning point in Chinese policy and mindset. Furthermore, the wars illuminated the intersection of commerce, addiction, and diplomacy. Opium, introduced initially for profit, had become a tool of geopolitical leverage, undermining the Qing economy and societal cohesion. The British effectively combined economic influence with military force, ensuring compliance with trade demands. The lesson was clear. In the modernizing world, economic power could dictate military and political outcomes.
With the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the Qing Dynasty officially acknowledged the terms imposed by Britain, marking a turning point in Chinese history. The treaty was unequal, favoring British interests while leaving China with diminished control over its own ports and trade policies. Cities like Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, and Fuzhou were opened to foreign commerce, and Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, becoming a permanent foothold for Western influence. While the legal terms were clear, the social and economic implications were profound, altering daily life, commerce, and governance across the empire. The immediate aftermath of the treaty revealed the extent of disruption. Merchants in the opened ports navigated an unfamiliar system where foreign traders could operate with legal protections previously unavailable to them. Local authorities struggled to enforce traditional taxation systems, while the influx of foreign goods and currency further destabilized regional economies. Households accustomed to self-sufficient livelihoods suddenly faced competition from imported textiles, spices, and other commodities, forcing many artisans and farmers to adapt quickly or face economic decline. Socially, the treaty intensified the spread of opium and other foreign commodities. Addiction, already a significant problem, grew in scale as traders gained legal avenues to sell their products. Families found themselves dealing with the consequences of widespread substance abuse, including diminished productivity, financial strain, and moral conflict. The psychological impact on ordinary citizens was equally severe. Observing foreign dominance and the ceding of territories created a sense of national humiliation that permeated both urban and rural communities. Administratively, the Qing court faced mounting pressure to reform. Officials debated the need to modernize the military, improve fiscal policies, and strengthen infrastructure to prevent further encroachments. These discussions often highlighted a tension between adopting Western innovations and preserving traditional Chinese governance and cultural practices. Military leaders, scholars, and bureaucrats disagreed on strategies, reflecting a larger debate about the empire's path forward. The human cost of the treaty extended beyond the political elite. Laborers, farmers, and artisans experienced the economic ripple effects acutely. Supply chains shifted as foreign imports became increasingly dominant, reducing demand for local products. This disruption forced some families to migrate to port cities in search of work, while others remained in rural areas, struggling to maintain their farms and workshops. In these communities, social hierarchies shifted, with some individuals gaining wealth through trade and collaboration with foreigners, while others fell into poverty. Education and intellectual life underwent a period of reevaluation. Scholars and teachers began to incorporate lessons from foreign technology, navigation, and military strategy into their curricula. Some advocated for a selective assimilation of Western knowledge, emphasizing its necessity to strengthen China's position on the global stage. Others resisted, focusing on the preservation of Confucian ethics, literature, and traditional learning. This intellectual tension shaped debates over reform for decades, influencing policy, governance, and social attitudes well beyond the immediate post-war period. Culturally, the treaty and its consequences inspired both anxiety and creativity. Artists, writers, and performers responded to the changing environment by producing works reflecting the upheaval. Paintings, literature, and theater often depicted scenes of moral decay, loss, and resilience. providing a medium through which citizens could process their collective trauma. These creative expressions offered comfort, instruction, and a sense of continuity, even as foreign influence encroached upon daily life. The economic consequences of the treaty were not limited to trade imbalances. The continued outflow of silver, driven by opium purchases and payment of reparations, created financial instability. Local economies that once relied on agriculture, artisanal crafts, and regional trade now faced an unpredictable market dictated by foreign powers. Inflation, scarcity, and fluctuating prices affected households across the empire, compelling citizens to develop new strategies for survival. Rural areas, though distant from major ports, were not immune to the treaty's effects. Farmers contended with the dual pressures of disrupted markets and labor shortages. Villagers faced requisitions by regional authorities, competition from imported goods, and increasing dependence on cash crops. Families had to adapt their agricultural practices, sometimes abandoning traditional crops in favor of marketable alternatives demanded by foreign trade networks. Health and medicine continued to present challenges. Disease, malnutrition, and poor sanitation persisted, exacerbated by the stresses of economic and social change. Opium addiction further undermined public health, weakening the workforce and increasing familial and community strain. Despite these challenges, families employed traditional remedies and local knowledge to mitigate suffering, demonstrating resilience amidst adversity. Diplomatically, the Treaty of Nanking established a precedent for subsequent interactions with foreign powers. Other Western nations soon demanded similar concessions, leveraging the British example to negotiate favorable terms. China's sovereignty was increasingly challenged, prompting leaders to consider strategies for modernization, defensive measures, and international diplomacy. The period after the treaty became a critical moment in which the empire's future trajectory was uncertain, shaped by both external pressure and internal debate. As the Qing Dynasty grappled with the consequences of the Treaty of Nanking, the long-term societal and economic impact became increasingly evident. The ceding of Hong Kong to Britain was only the first of many concessions that would erode Chinese sovereignty. This event marked a shift in regional power, signaling to both domestic and foreign observers that China's military and political strength could no longer prevent external influence. For ordinary citizens, this transition was less about geopolitics and more about the direct changes in their daily lives, from trade disruptions to shifting labor demands. The opened ports became hubs of cultural and economic exchange, but the influx of foreign traders brought unforeseen challenges. Local markets were flooded with imported goods that undermined traditional industries. Artisans who once thrived on local demand now faced competition from cheaper, mass-produced items from abroad. Farmers saw their staple crops devalued as imported grains, textiles, and commodities entered the market, reducing income and increasing financial uncertainty. These disruptions forced families to alter their livelihoods, sometimes abandoning generational crafts and farming practices in favor of unfamiliar trades. Opium, already a growing social problem, intensified in the treaty's aftermath. Its legal importation into the open ports expanded availability, and usage increased across social classes. Merchants, officials, laborers, and even scholars found themselves drawn into addiction, eroding productivity and weakening community structures. Families faced the compounded burden of financial strain and moral dilemmas as loved ones succumbed to the habit. Public health, already fragile, further deteriorated under the weight of substance abuse and poverty, creating a cycle of vulnerability that would persist for decades. The Qing administration attempted reforms, but these measures were frequently hindered by corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and resistance from conservative factions. Some officials advocated modernization of military technology and trade regulations, while others insisted on maintaining traditional practices. This tug-of-war slowed the implementation of effective policies, leaving many communities exposed to the pressures of a changing economy and foreign influence. Strategic planning was often reactive rather than proactive, addressing immediate crises without a coherent long-term vision. Education became a battleground for reform and tradition. Teachers and scholars debated the integration of Western knowledge, particularly in science, navigation, and military strategy. Schools in major cities began experimenting with curricula that combined traditional Confucian teachings with lessons in mathematics, geography, and engineering. These hybrid approaches aimed to prepare a new generation capable of navigating a world increasingly influenced by foreign powers. Yet, in rural areas, adherence to established traditions persisted, creating disparities in knowledge and preparedness across the empire. Cultural responses to the treaty were equally complex. Writers, artists, and performers chronicled the social upheaval through their works, offering commentary on the erosion of traditional life and the challenges of foreign domination. Literature and visual arts became vehicles for both education and catharsis, providing citizens with narratives that reflected their experiences of loss, resilience, and adaptation. Public performance spaces, such as local theaters and community gatherings, helped to disseminate these cultural responses, fostering a shared understanding of the societal shifts underway. Economic consequences extended beyond market disruptions. The continued outflow of silver for opium purchases and treaty reparations created inflationary pressures, destabilizing local currencies and undermining household security. Merchants and families struggled to maintain stable finances in the face of fluctuating prices, reduced crop values, and diminished market demand. For many, these financial pressures necessitated migration to urban centers or coastal ports, seeking employment in trade-related industries, while those remaining in rural villages adapted subsistence strategies to survive. Rural communities faced unique challenges, with younger family members often leaving for cities. Older generations were left to manage farms with diminished labor. Agricultural productivity suffered, creating a precarious food supply and increasing reliance on imported staples. Villages encountered pressure to convert to cash crops or sell land to meet tax obligations, further altering the social and economic fabric. Despite these hardships, many communities retained traditional practices, blending old methods with emerging economic realities to ensure survival. The psychological impact of the treaty's consequences cannot be overstated. Witnessing the loss of sovereignty, the ceding of territory, and the dominance of foreign traders fostered a pervasive sense of humiliation. Citizens grappled with a new reality in which power and autonomy seemed increasingly out of reach. This collective trauma influenced social behaviors, cultural expressions, and intellectual debates, shaping a national consciousness acutely aware of both vulnerability and the need for resilience. Diplomatically, the Treaty of Nanking set a precedent for further concessions to foreign powers. Western nations, noting Britain's success, demanded similar agreements, expanding their influence over trade, governance, and territorial access. China's negotiating position weakened, compelling officials to engage in complex diplomacy while attempting to protect core interests. These negotiations often involved delicate balancing acts, with Qing leaders striving to avoid additional humiliations, while recognizing the empire's limited capacity to resist. Military and defensive reforms became urgent priorities. The technological disparity between Chinese forces and Western armies was starkly highlighted during the Opium Wars. Leaders sought to modernize weaponry, fortify ports, and train new units capable of responding to future threats. Resistance to reform persisted, however, due to ideological commitments to traditional military structures and skepticism of Western methods. As a result, progress was uneven, with some regions advancing rapidly, while others remained vulnerable to foreign encroachment.